Hello, welcome to this episode of Ask Adam Live. Ask is the acronym for Always Seek Knowledge. I request, ask, or invite that you seek knowledge, not only about yourself and understand you and what you're about, what your values are, what makes you feel good, what makes you feel bad. Know about you. I also invite you to know about others and to know possibly, what makes them feel good or bad. And also to be, inquisitive about the life around you. I feel like the more that we know, the more we become a little bit more empathetic of life around us and the people we're sharing it with. Also, strangers, people we might not know. Ask, always seek knowledge. Welcome to today's show where Storycraft for sales. People rarely buy information. They buy a belief, an emotion, a possibility. If you stayed up late and watched any late night, what do they call infomercials that they called them, where they were selling something, right? And they let you know all the aspects about it. They had lots of people, the testimonials, they called it, right? Facts explained, but man, the stories moved, right? When they would share with you what happened to this individual because they did something. Now, there's always the disclaimer that's the individual results may vary. Remember that one? Little asterisk at the bottom of the screen. See, people tune out the pitches, the features. They start blurring together when you're talking statistics. And data alone, well, that rarely creates an action. If you're just talking numbers and stats and whatnot, yeah, it just doesn't have the same effect. But when someone here's a story they relate to, man, their attention turns instantly. Because stories create emotion. They lower the resistance. Quite frankly, they build trust. They also allow people to see themselves in the outcome and not just see it as it could be, but that it actually is, already is. I found many times in my real estate conversations where I was telling stories, and especially after about a year or two of being in the business and tackling some of the predominant neighborhoods in the area that, well, they were kind of sought after as well, is I had stories to share of, and it also didn't hurt. This was in the locale was the Mid Atlantic area in the northern continental U.S., and it was about 2 hours west of Washington, D.C. And if you know anything about American history, that's kind of where the birthplace of things began with the history of politics and the democracy known as the United States. So there was a lot of history to the adjacent land where many homes were. So to have the story in the one town just over the hill that George Washington had negotiated because it was actually his, and I'm going to get into the story and I'll keep it short. Anyway, the locale, quick history lesson, the locale was a town that was purchased, owned, and taken over by a king or a lord from England who came over and took over the ground. And back in the day, young George Washington, he was a surveyor at the time, had befriended this lord. And part of his negotiations was he acquired acreages of walnut trees down by the river basin in one of his negotiations for work. And he kept this ground forever. or for a fairly long time, even I think almost up to the Mount Vernon days and presidency and stuff like that. But he did visit this Lord when he had free time, which was the original Camp David. But just imagine having that note of history and having that story, or even to know that the house down the street was owned by George Washington's cousin who lived in the town. I mean, that's kind of interesting, right? Especially if you purchased a house on that street, um, or to be on Washington Avenue was kind of a predominant street, and so it was kind of to share that story with people often intrigued them to be even more motivated to purchase such a property because it had a story. Um, that was one of the anchorings in my stint with insurance sales, was just telling the story, and I didn't really like it. I gotta be, I'm gonna be, I'm always upfront, but I'm gonna be even more upfront with this. Is that I hated the stories because they were sad, and who, because you're selling insurance and it's something that you're paying for today to have a benefit tomorrow, but the benefit has never has the outcome. Like I don't care what the policy is. Yeah, there's a certain niceness, but I got to share with you. At the end of the day, I would rather have that person's company than to have any benefit of a monetary return from them, right? So that's just sad. So to tell a sad story about how a monetization of someone's loss became someone else's gain, and there was a few stories, but I digress. That's why I'm not in the business, honestly. I think the sales was beautiful. It was a great product. People need it. Unfortunately, they don't um, want it when they can get it, and then when they need it, they can't get it. And the business, I digress. I'm going to be nice today. I'm not in it anymore, but I can share with you that stories, leadership, mentoring leaders. When I share with a leader, not specific details, but that I've been able to help leaders grow and to pivot their business and change their mindset just with a few conversations or continuous learning and meetings and being part of the mentor group, that when I tell those stories to other leaders, they want to be that leader too. They want to be part of that group, and they're very anxious to be part of that group. It's a very captive audience. And so that knowing that those stories come from that group and that um, gathering, they want to be a participant. Um, when I speak, the few times that I speak, um, people want to be there. They want to hear what it is that I'm sharing because it's so moving and motivated because of the stories, the diversity of my life and the four careers that I've been through, and the happy and the horror and the tragedies and the adjustments and the flexibility and the sucks to be you, but how I want to be you, or I would have loved to be you, or what an amazing experience. And, those are the feedbacks that I get. And when I share that with people and they hear of those stories, they're engaged and they're inspired. So people forget the statistics, but they remember the stories that are being shared. And we can go into a whole masterclass of how those come together. But for this particular episode, I just want to share with you the 5-part Storycraft framework that turns stories into trust, connection, and if need to, that sales momentum without sounding manipulative or scripted. Again, one of the things I didn't like about insurance was that it constantly was being scripted. With real estate, I remember the two of my greatest mentors, a gentleman by the name of Floyd Wickman, was the diamond of salesmanship, and he didn't did tell me about stories, but I remember one of his most quoted phrases was, "If I could spell, I could sell." And I remember creating, which was probably my gravitational love for acronyms as well. Another gentleman that was my mentor was David Knox. And it wasn't really scripting that David shared with me, it was more of learning and understanding the business so that I could be and do. And I will share with you that probably my first 6 months, I emulated David. I was David. I remember sitting at a table a couple of times negotiating with a client over things and laughing at myself because that sounded like David. But I was emulating and mimicking him in a certain degree as I was developing my personality. Within about a year or two, I was being me, doing kind of what David would do, but as me, and doing it with that experience. But those first 6 months, I was David. So I share with you that story is that none of his stuff was manipulative or scripted. I mean, I remembered what he said and I just regurgitated what he said, but it wasn't scripted because it came from my voice and it wasn't reading something that I memorized. So maybe it's the same thing. I'm not sure. But I do know when I got into the insurance business, the several companies that I did work for were constantly script, script, script. You have to know your script. I'm not a pushy salesperson. And if I cannot, first of all, you're coming to me because you want to do something. Second of all, I'm just sharing with you the multiple ways you can do it. We figure it out together. I guide you, I coach you, I mentor you into making the best decision and letting you know all of the aspects of making that decision. Probably made me a better coach than a salesperson, but I digress. I'm not a big fan of scripts. I don't like scripts. So let's get into part one. Why do stories sell? Stories work because they organize information emotionally. A story starts with a beginning, a middle, an end. There's even the 7-part story aspect where it's like the hero's journey, if you've heard of that. But we'll keep it simple for this is why do stories sell? They activate the imagination. You know, when you read the book of any adventure, tale, or story, you found yourself being that character or the character adjacent, but you found yourself in that fantasy land. You found yourself in that land of wonder or in the adventures of someone doing something or being the superhero, right? You found yourself seeing yourself in the mirror, right? It also it reduces a level of skepticism. You know, it's not when you hear the success of someone else that you're not skeptical that it's just something that nobody's ever tried. Those stories and tales of what someone else has done reminds you that it's possible. And part of that, much like reading a book with a superhero, is you help create the identification with that person, the main character, the adjacent character, if you will. So this is how these stories help to share what it is that you're sharing and engage or get your client or customer or individual to engage in your offerings. As I share many times in the neuro encoding workshops that I do, people learn and change through emotion, visualization, and with that internal association. See, if they can see themselves in the story, they begin to believe the results. And that's not hyperbole. It's that they believe it and that the result is possible. Because at the end of the day, people buy certainty, the emotional relief it offers, and the identity transformation. Stories sell faster because of the certainty, the emotional relief it offers, and the identity transformation. I can utter facts all day long. I can share with you the statistic measurements. I remember even trying to convince some 20-year-old somethings of the mathematical value of just saving, instead of thinking it as a life policy and you're not going to die tomorrow and all of this stuff, just think of it as the mathematical savings of a cup of coffee every day, right? $5 a day times 5 times of work, it's $25 a week. You multiply that times 4 weeks a month, you're talking $100. Now, if it only costs you, say, $20 to $50 a month, so we're now talking half the price of your coffee to ensure that later on, 30, 40, 50 years, which is forever away to a 20 something, no offense to you, but I was there too. Certainly wasn't thinking of old age. In fact, 50, 60 was old. Not so much anymore, but we learn. And you will learn as well. But nonetheless, just trying to share that less than half the price of a cup of coffee every week, that you would engage in the opportunity to better your future self with the compounding interest of this, plus give you some level of protection during the duration until that point. Doesn't that seem like it makes sense? I lost him at coffee. So the story of the 20 something that about 5 years later, all of a sudden there was a devastation, lost their partner, had to um, reevaluate their life, had to keep trying to pay for the house. They didn't have that other half of the income, and being vested into a policy, therefore, ensured that they could stay in their home as well as create some level of continuous income. Sounded a lot better to them. See how that story kind of correlates? Again, going back to the locale of history, stories delivered faster. Now they were fascinated. They wanted to be connected to that historical value, and the idea that the cabin might need a little work, it didn't occur. It didn't occur to them at all, but they wanted part of that historical value that was adjacent to them. So see how the story delivers much faster than facts alone. Part two, Storycraft for sales. Here's the framework. Start with the struggle. If you're in sales, understand your client, your customer. Every story, a powerful story, begins with some tension. Maybe it's a measurement of confusion or overwhelm, possibly the fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of frustration. Maybe someone's dealing with. I remember frustration, selling insurance, and this in the city, and this particular client, they didn't want to be devastated by losing, and they'd already lost two sons. I think they had total of five. They lost two and they had three left, and they were tired of the devastation and the frustration of not having enough to bury this person. So they purchased policies for the remaining three sons. I know, tough to take in. Sorry to bring you down during this energetic podcast, but it's just, again, not why I'm not in the business anymore. But without that tension and sharing that with someone else, there's no emotional connection. Maybe it's in that same example, the overwhelm of having to go through the final expenses of a funeral. And even on the low budget side, you're talking 5, 10. And again, I don't want to get in on that, but when you share that with someone else, all of a sudden they're like, yeah, I don't want that either. Matter of fact, I don't think there's a risk because I don't live in the city and there's not crime and violence and stuff in my area. But yeah, I don't think I want that risk for my loved ones. So let me engage in getting some type of coverage like this. So it's that fear that would engage someone to want that protection. See, people lean in because they recognize themselves. and even not exactly recognizing themselves, but even peripherally recognizing themselves, that they're adjacent to that character. So they move forward with that story. I have lots of stories, but that's not, well, that's part of the podcast, but I don't want to bore you with stories. You got to introduce the turning point. Many times this is with our stories as well as like the hero's journey, right? There's a point where there's the struggle, and then the turning point when there's that realization. What changed? See, this is where the insight appears for the receiver of the story that you're sharing. And the realization happens that, oh, this could happen to me. And that always follows by a decision can get made from this realization, because it's not the numbers, it's not even the statistics. You don't even have to share statistics. Just the fact that it happened to one person could happen to anyone. And so once the human mind sort of realizes that, well, we want to make a decision. So once you have a level of insight, and of course the realization, the human mind immediately wants to make a decision. So now it's, what's the best decision for you? See, I can give you an example that it wasn't when I was participating in insurance sales, for instance. I realized the problem wasn't my efforts. I had the efforts, I had the stories, I had all the products. I was licensed with 7, 8 different companies. So I had plenty of products at my disposal to share with you at all price points. But it was the lack of clarity that individuals that I was speaking to just didn't see the value. But some of them that I spoke to and shared the stories with, the turning points created hope that they weren't going to be a statistic. They weren't going to be faced with a situation like this, that they were going to be the ones that created change, if you will, that they were going to be the outcast. They were going to be slightly different. So show the process. Now, don't skip this part. People need to understand how the transformation happened. Where it was that they understood they were in that position of needing a product like that, right? That they could relate. Same thing with real estate. The transformation happened when they wanted to be a part of something greater than themselves, like the adjacent, right? Mr. Washington having some property next door. Wow. The the historic aspects of the town, where when people did come visit you, they could go to the historic town. What a great landing aspect for people to come see you, and not only come socialize with friends, but go hang out at a historical town where George Washington himself walked the streets and took a bath in the state park. Yeah, there's more detail on that. We can certainly share with that in the link. But anyway, the transformation happened because they felt themselves engaged. They felt themselves wanting to be a part of something, right? The clarity sprint, as I had mentioned. So having the structure of the story creates the trust of first having a problem, sharing, understanding your client's situation, sharing a story of how someone else too as well discovered this problem or had this problem, and how a solution then helped with that problem. It eased that problem, made something better than the problem. the solution. Having that structure, this creates trust each and every time. So when you're sharing your story, maybe somebody asks you about why you did something. You have a story about why you created something, why you're a solopreneur, why you're in the business of doing something. You have that story. I know many of the people I worked with in the insurance business all had stories that they struggled through something, or they understood someone who struggled and they said, I could change that. I could be an agent for change. And I don't want anyone else to struggle. So I'm going to make sure to provide my friends, my family, and find more people that don't have this option set up or available to them, and figure out how to implement this in their life so that they don't struggle. So that structure not only built the first story, that created the second story, that created an individual to do something now in sales that is utilizing the same structure. So see how it fits? So let's reveal and look at the transformation. Before, there was stress, uncertainty, and of course, very reactive, emotional. That, well, what if this happens to me? Now, after hearing the story and understanding the solution, they're focused, they're more confident, and they're progressing towards a change. They're ready to implement something that's going to make their life better. They're going to do that change to maybe have some confidence with their friends, by living in a historical area, by having some stories to talk about, by just enjoying someone's company in a historical area, if you will, and being able to tell the stories from that. I can share with you in the aspect of real estate, just because the insurance is really kind of bringing me down today, and I'm sorry. I remember past clients that came to me and said, hey, we had people over at our place, and they love the aspect of the historical town and all the amenities around town and the neighborhood that we live in, and they're thinking they would like something like that. But their one caveat is that they would like a view, not necessarily the water. Well, great, I could find that. Now all of a sudden there's stories of the view. And when I would talk to individuals later, and they would tell me how they would, come to recreate in their second home and have some coffee and watch nature move in the woods, or to see the transformation of the leaves that would occur seasonally in the trees, or how they would see and enjoy the fog lifting from the river down in the valley, and how each time they looked out their picture window that they marveled so much about this particular residence that it just renewed so much of their life. That story that I could then, with their permission, share with people helped to even build more focus, confidence, and progress in my business. Because when I would ask people, well, what are you looking for? Why do you seek wanting a second home in this particular location? What do you want it to do for you? And they would say, well, I need a place to recharge. I need a place to get away from the city. I run several businesses, and I just need a place to get away from the vibe for a minute. Okay, so would it interest you to have like a picture window and be able to watch nature? Would you like to wake up and hear the babbling of the brook or a river in proximity to the location? Oh my gosh, that would be transformational. Well, I had a couple that said the same thing, and we're looking for the same thing, and we found some really great places in this location. Oh my gosh, they were already there. They were already seeing themselves sitting on the porch. And I wasn't selling a thing, but just telling them the story of what someone else had done. And they didn't even have to know that person, but just know that there was another human being having the enjoyment that they were seeking. And they couldn't wait to start looking at places and make that decision for themselves to find that enjoyment. In fact, they were so excited, they would call and, can we close? I really want to spend this weekend. Can we get this done by summer? I can't wait to get there when the weather's nice. I remember one client, it was around October, just catching the end of the leaves turning, and they couldn't wait to just sit. And although the leaves were kind of have all fallen, and they let me know in the follow up as part of my routine that although the forest appeared dead and it wasn't as exciting as the spring when everything was green and wasn't as or the summer it was, and it wasn't as beautiful as the fall when they did the property inspection, but when they went and now the forest was dead, that it was slightly depressing, but it was also exciting because this was a part that they hadn't yet seen of this property, and they couldn't wait to see what winter was like and the excitement of seeing summer again. And although they missed the fall, they were strategically, they even asked, hey, when's the best time for the colors to change? I want to make sure and put it on my calendar to be there. So they were already forecasting their future experience. Sales. See, we didn't talk dollars, we didn't talk contract, we didn't talk anything. They were already there just from understanding what they wanted and sharing with them a story of how someone had done something. I'll give another quick extraordinary uh, story, although it was in real estate too, because I'm keeping the vibes up. No more insurance. There was a couple that was looking for some acreage because they had horses, but they also wanted to expand the horses that they had and basically caretake for horses was part of their retirement plan. Maybe even board some horses for individuals and set that up. And what did it look like? And the transformation of just showing them a couple of things, but then watching the extraordinary explosion of seeing just a 3-stall barn and a cabin, very downsized from what they had originally envisioned. But they also saw hope because there was acreage and it was secluded. And they were absolutely just transformed when not only was sharing the idea, but when they found the perfect property, it sold itself. It sold itself. And their dream became something. Now, these are just a few of the stories. It wasn't all of them. Can't say that all of my sales were magical. Some was just people, downsizing, upsizing, moving to a different neighborhood from another neighborhood, gravitating towards the city or away from the city. And there was a lot of just general transactions that occurred through 12 years of sales. But in real estate, again, a lot of it was just the stories that you do enough transactions, you do have enough stories. So it's the transformation is what sells when they can see themselves. Now, it didn't magically happen too. I gotta share with you that there's a lot of hard work involved too, because you have to know your market, you have to know your geography, and you have to know where things are at. You have to know accessibility, and you can't just blindly kind of go into this. But once you know your craft and you know the ins and outs and the details, although you rarely share them, it's the stories that you're sharing, but it's understanding where your client wants to go and then sharing that particular story. So you really have to build up some stories. You have to have some sales under your belt to create those stories, and then you can then express those sales and create the the idea that someone is looking for. So I don't want to make it sound too easy because I pretty much could hone into the geography of where someone was at just based on what we talked about in some preliminary conversation. Invite, don't pressure. See, the week sale is buy now, get it or else. Limited time offer. Strong Storycraft. This may sound familiar. This framework may help you too. See, this is influence through alignment, not force. And why authentic stories win is people can sense exaggeration as well as performance. If you're acting and theatrical, that's inauthenticity at its finest. And people will see that. But when you're genuine and sharing, like here today, the best stories are real, vulnerable in the case of insurance, relatable. When I told the story of someone enjoying that cup of coffee and seeing nature, my client was like, especially enjoying a cup of coffee at the office. We were at the office at a conference table talking, and they were like actually having coffee, picturing themselves. They're like, there's the deer. We're in a conference room. That's how real it was. That's how real it was. Sorry, the coffee tastes good today. But it's real, it's relatable, and it's also teachable. Many of the stories I tell now are teachable moments that share with you that success is possible, and that what you write, you invite, and what you invite becomes what you are, and what you are becomes who you become. And that becomes a pretty amazing person. We do a workshop about the storytelling principles, the Alasa method. Probably get into that. Well, not too much, but it's the stages of that storytelling and the principles of it, where it's a confession plus a solution model. See, people trust leaders who are honest about the climb, not just the outcome. When you see that someone else has struggled, and you don't just see their success, but you know the stories of them being in the proverbial trenches of the business and in the muck and in the stress and all that, well, you can relate to that, especially if you're just starting out. But if I shared with you all the success and stuff that's going on now, you would see it as being unattainable. And you'd be in that mindset of, oh, that's only for you, or that's your success. But when I share with you that I went through some tough times too, and that I struggled, and that I had a learning curve that I had to work through, that now you can relate. And now you can see that it's not hype, that there's actually truth in what I'm sharing, because it comes from authenticity. So remember you got to share some of the tough stuff in the beginning. And then there's the transformation, the feeling of emotion. Then it's the outcome. What did you become? Every single one of you have a story, especially if you're listening to this podcast and you're following the Ask Adam Live social media, and you've gone through this transformation. That's your story. That's your authentic story, is that you went from this and then you discovered what we share on this podcast, and you started implementing it in your life and in your business, and then it created something. That's your story. You can share that, and it becomes your selling point, whether it's friendship or finding a business partner, or whether it's just being that solopreneur where you're asking for that next level up, if you will, and looking at that next business. Just to touch on that, is that it's relatable when you are asking for something, maybe some assistance from another business or a partner, and they say, well, why would I want to partner with you? And you say, well, I've been through the trenches and I've done this and that. I'm trying to limit my mistakes, and I have a healthy mindset and strategy. And I really feel that we align. And if that person has the same, then they see themselves in you, and they're going to get, or you're going to get, their buy-in. And it's not necessarily that you have money or skills, but just that you have the drive of success. And that's what they're buying into in their level of partnership that's negotiated with you. So you can use it with quite frankly, anything, right? I mean, we could even touch on relationships if you'd want to go there. How many people do you know, even yourself, that you found you related to someone and you're with someone, you're commingling now with someone because you felt that they kind of, once you talked and understood that, man, they went through the same tough things you did. It's the elementary aspects of life. It's growing, silly stuff in our 20s, growing up in our 30s, maybe finding a career and honing in on it. And then we find somebody who also made silly mistakes, found themselves building a career, and we admire and like them for that. Well, that's their story. And we've related to that story, which we bought into to be a part of that. So, switching gears, here's some of the common storytelling mistakes: too much detail, the emotional tension. There's really no lesson or takeaway. They got to have something that they can absorb. Another mistake is making yourself the hero and not the guide. How many times have you heard someone say that it was because of something? I read this book, changed my life. I watched a movie, changed my life. I understood a new aspect about something, changed my life. It's not them, something else. And once they learned, they became something else. And now they want to help others. Probably something I'm still slightly guilty of in this episode is talking too long before getting to the point. If you're rattling on about something and you're not quite telling the story, which is why you need to have your framework in place and have that outline of your story in place and know your story, you'll find yourself talking too long before you get to the point. Now you've lost them again, just like with the level of statistics. One thing you might say, which is kind of a weak statement, I hear it often with motivational people, is I help people improve productivity. Where a story driven response might be, I used to finish every day exhausted, but still feel behind. Once I learned how to reduce everything to the critical few and protect the focused time blocks, my stress dropped and my execution improved. See how that changes the picture that we've painted? Because you're explaining that you finished the day tired, still overwhelmed. And once you learned something, honed in, created the alignment and the parameters, started to protect yourself mentally, physically, emotionally, treated time a little bit more precious, you actually found a solution. And that it created something better from that. That one short story is now relatable, emotional, and believable, and even actionable. Right? You've even provided a point of action. So even if someone doesn't specifically ask how, you've already shared that with them. So now you're being much more specific with your language by stating, I used to finish every day exhausted, but still feeling behind. Once I learned how to reduce everything to the critical few and protect focused time blocks, my stress dropped and my execution improved. Now, as you hear that, do you not want to have you want to have more of a conversation with this person? because you want to understand more, right? Tell me about uh, how to put things into the critical few. Tell me what you learned. How do you protect your focus time blocks? And your stress dropping? Well, that's absolutely what I want, because who out there has stress? Who doesn't want to drop it? And you've shared with me that your execution improved. So that being said, I would like that too. Tell me more. So it created action. And being that you did it, I want to do it. And when you tell me that, I almost feel emotionally connected to you, because we both had the same concern that you mentioned earlier about finishing the day tired. So it's relatable. Stories are bridges. They connect pain to possibility. And when people see themselves in the transformation, they move. This has been another excellent, most excellent, and I hope you agree, episode of Ask Adam Live. Now let us all tell stories and make it a great day.